Stories this hour. A second death from COVID-19 in Sydney as New South Wales records 89 new cases. A confirmed COVID case in regional New South Wales, a worker in Goulburn, about 200 kilometres southwest of Sydney, tests positive, prompting calls for tighter restrictions on travel. A crew of infected removalists from New South Wales forces a Melbourne apartment building into isolation. And the Prime Minister to announce financial support for businesses and individuals impacted by Sydney's lockdown. Well, the New South Wales Premier says an announcement on the future of Sydney's lockdown will come by Thursday at the latest. The restrictions do appear to be having an impact, with a fall in case numbers compared to yesterday and fewer people active in the community while infectious. But Gladys Berejiklian is continuing to urge people to stay at home, warning Sydney is not yet out of the woods. The state recorded 89 new locally acquired COVID-19 cases and the second death linked to the Delta variant outbreak, a man in his 70s from Sydney's eastern suburbs. At least 21 of today's cases were in the community for their entire infectious period. 9 were isolated for part of it. The status of a further 4 cases is still being determined. That means up to 34 people were infectious in the community at some stage. Now, of the cases reported today, 64 are from southwestern Sydney, and that is of course still the biggest concern for health authorities. 15 have been detected in southeastern Sydney, 5 from the inner parts of Sydney and 3 from the city's west. Fairfield in Sydney's southwest remains an area of major concern for health officials in this outbreak. For more, I spoke to our reporter Alison Zhao.
Fairfield is indeed an area of great concern to health authorities, and that's because 64 of today's 89 cases are from the southwestern Sydney area and particularly Fairfield. So they've called on residents in this area, that's the Liverpool, Canterbury, Bankstown and Fairfield local government areas, to go out and get tested as much as possible. Of today's cases, 59 of them are household contacts, and the Chief Health Officer, Dr. Carrie Chant, says that once a case enters a household, it's almost inevitable that the rest of the household will contract COVID-19. And there's also a new requirement out for surveillance testing, and that means that if you're an essential worker and you're travelling from Greater Sydney to regional New South Wales, you'll need to get a COVID-19 test every week. And if you live in the Fairfield local government area and you're leaving this area to go and do essential work outside of this council area, you'll need to go and get tested every 3 days. Now, with this new requirement, it doesn't actually mean that you have to self-isolate after a test. So this is just surveillance testing. But if you do have any symptoms whatsoever, you will have to self-isolate, not interact with anybody else, and stay at home and only go out to go and get tested. And they've also said that they want to warn people that if they are employing people to come to their house or business, that they should ask them where they live, where else they've worked, and when the last time they got a COVID-19 test was. And this requirement kicks in from midnight tonight. They say that although Fairfield is the area of greatest concern, they want everyone in this area and across the state to remain vigilant. We heard earlier from the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian. Let's take a listen.
We will ask people who are working or moving between Greater Metropolitan Sydney and into the regions to get a weekly COVID test, even if they don't have symptoms, just to make sure that we reduce the incidence of essential workers passing on the virus. And we do appreciate that for many citizens, conducting essential work is what all of us rely on. But we just can't afford to have the virus spread through that essential work, and we need to make sure that people keep everybody else free.
The New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian there. And Alison, incredibly sad news with another death being recorded. What can you tell us about that?
Unfortunately, a man in his 70s has passed away from COVID-19. We know that he was an eastern suburbs man, but it hasn't been revealed yet whether he was vaccinated or not. And he is the 58th death in New South Wales. And it comes after the first death of the outbreak was reported on Sunday of a woman in her 90s from the southwestern Sydney area. So it's definitely very sad news. And the Chief Health Officer has also flagged the number of hospitalisations in the state. 65 people are now in hospital with COVID-19. 21 of those are in the intensive care unit and 4 people are on a ventilator. And she says there's a number of people in ICU, and young people at that, who don't have any comorbidities. So she's reinforced that this virus, this Delta variant, is affecting people, not only the elderly, but also young people and relatively healthy people as well.
And Alison, there's been a lot of discussion throughout the course of this outbreak about whether or not Sydney-siders, particularly those in the west and southwest of the city, have been complying with the lockdown restrictions. What are police saying about people doing or not doing the right thing at the moment?
Matt, police say that yesterday they issued 121 infringement notices and 34 of those were in southwestern Sydney. The Deputy Commissioner Gary Warboys said that this was actually a good effort and that they were pleased to see so many people, the majority of people in southwestern Sydney, complying with the orders and the requirements that are in place to stay at home and not leave except for those 4 essential reasons. He also flagged that they wanted to see less people congregating in common street areas. They say that there's too many people who are gathering around takeaway stores, particularly takeaway food and coffee venues, and they wanted to make sure that people were aware that if they were going out and getting takeaway, that they needed to leave the area as soon as they got their food. Let's take a listen.
We had an example recently which highlights this, where people gathered their takeaway goods, moved a short distance away, and then proceeded to hook up a movie on a device and sit there and watch that movie.
Deputy New South Wales Police Commissioner Gary Warboys there. Now, Alison, school holidays are over. It means that a lot of parents are going to have to do a bit of a juggle now, considering lockdown is still in place. How are parents feeling?
Well, parents are feeling worried and concerned about the uncertainty of the length of this lockdown. Of course, the lockdown is supposed to technically lift this Friday, and parents were initially told that their kids would only have to learn online for 4 days and go back to school next Monday, but we don't know what exactly is the case. The Premier says that she wants to announce a lockdown extension either tomorrow or on Thursday, and the Education Minister has also said that there'll be new advice for parents about what's happening with schooling in the coming days. And we also know that many parents are struggling to juggle this online learning, but the children of workers who can't work from home are being allowed to send their kids to school. And we saw earlier this morning at Preston's public school, which is in southwestern Sydney near Liverpool, that there are a number of children who were coming to class and who did have to attend because they were the children of parents who couldn't work from home. And we heard from one mother about what her experience was. Let's take a listen.
Over the school holidays, I've obviously had to be at home because I've had no option to send the kids anywhere. Their vacation care was cancelled. But yeah, so they're at school. I don't have an option, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Do you feel like school's a safe place for them to be?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. If I didn't, I wouldn't be sending them.
Are you worried about the uncertainty of how long this will go on for?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my work is quite flexible. Both their father and I are both essential workers, so the work is flexible. But yeah, we are really worried because I don't know how long they're going to be able to provide us with the opportunity, to work from home on that hybrid model. So yeah, absolutely. It's definitely uncertain times.
Students are being told that if they are in year 7 or above in high school, that they will need to wear masks on campus from today, and that requirement is enforced this entire week. But we don't know what exactly the requirements and the mask mandate for schooling from this week forward will be, so we'll be waiting to hear more from the government in the coming days.
Alison Zhao in Fairfield in Sydney's southwest. Now, the COVID outbreak has spread to regional New South Wales with a case detected in Goulburn, about 200 kilometres southwest of Sydney. Our reporter Madeline Austin has more from Goulburn.
The positive case was an essential worker who had been commuting to and from Sydney to Goulburn daily to work here at the redevelopment at the Goulburn Base Hospital. The other workers and staff who were on the site have been sent home to isolate for 14 days. And what that means more broadly for the Goulburn area is that it's likely to become a hotspot for Queensland, and it's also put Canberra on high alert due to the amount of people who also commute between the two cities daily. Mulberry Council Mayor Bob Kirk has expressed concern that Goulburn is a vulnerable city and it's a disappointing development having a case.
All those close contacts over the next 24, 48 hours hopefully will be identified. We'll have testing and those results will be known. So any impacts on our local community we'll be aware of sooner than later, I guess. But it's just difficult that we've had to have the problem introduced in this manner.
The Southern Local Health District has set up multiple pop-up testing sites for all those people who will now need to get tested for COVID-19. And of course, regional New South Wales was already operating under a mask mandate, which most people here today have been following vigilantly.
Madeline Austin there, and as she mentioned, the ACT is now on alert because of that case in Goulburn. Goulburn being 200 odd k's southwest of Sydney, but a lot closer to the nation's capital. ACT Health has issued a statement saying it's working with New South Wales Health to figure out if there is going to be any impact on the ACT, which hasn't had a COVID case in the community since July last year. ACT Health trying to confirm if there are any workers from Canberra who were working at the same construction site in Goulburn. Now, Victoria has recorded one new COVID case in addition to 2 cases announced late yesterday, and residents of an apartment complex in Melbourne have been ordered into isolation for 14 days. Our reporter Stephanie Ferrier has the latest from Melbourne.
We have 3 cases now here in Melbourne that are all connected to the same household that's in the city of Hume. That's 2 parents and a child, and it's believed that a 4th member of the family is so far negative, but they are anticipating that that person will also test positive in the coming days. So that's our new case, was the 3rd household member that was connected to that. And also we have heard from Jerome Weimar, who's the testing COVID commander here for the Department of Health. He says that in fact they have given us fulsome information. They've gone and got tested at the first sign of symptoms, and they also acknowledged that they had actually gone out, despite being arrivals back from the red zone in New South Wales and isolating, or supposed to be isolating, for 14 days. They had visited a couple of exposure sites, including the Coles at Craigieburn on Saturday, as well as a small service station in Broadmeadows. So both of those sites are listed as Tier 1 exposure sites. At this stage, they aren't looking at taking any enforcement action against that family. The other strain of concern that health authorities are looking at the moment, and that is a 3-man removalist team who came over to Victoria from New South Wales on Thursday. They actually dropped off some furniture at a home in Craigieburn. There was a family of 5 there that are all isolating at the moment. So far, they've all tested negative. Then this 3-man team went on to the Ariel apartments in Maribyrnong in Melbourne's northwestern suburbs in the afternoon. And so they actually were there to pick up some furniture and spent several hours there doing that. Now, unfortunately, 2 of those 3 removalists have since tested positive since going back to New South Wales, and that has led to a major alert at this apartment complex, as well as at a couple of places in Bland that they stopped at on the way back, or actually on the way through to South Australia and then back to New South Wales. So what we are hearing is that all of these residents in some 78 apartments are having to now isolate for 14 days as well, because they are really concerned about those common areas, the stairwell, the foyers, the lifts as well. And Jerome Weimar is particularly concerned about the fact that he's not very confident about the information that they have received from these removalists.
They're not being as forthcoming, or their recollection is not as accurate as I would like it to be. The level of information that's coming through is not as fulsome as I'd like, and just the sense of clarity is not emerging as quickly as we would like.
But obviously it is a huge burden to bear for many of these residents who haven't long been out of lockdown in the past lockdown for Victoria, and after having doing all of those hard yards, they're really frustrated about the fact that this virus has come across from New South Wales again. Let's have a listen to what some of the residents had to say.
Oh, just annoyed that I don't have much time to prepare. Like, I can only go out to get tested. I can't go out for anything else. Well, you know, I've got a really sore back at the moment. I can't go to my chiropractor. I can't go to the supermarket and make sure I've got food. It's very annoying.
The problem is we don't know how to run our life at the moment. It's just, just in a second they said you have to live at home. And we don't know how to do the shopping, how we can get the things.
You kind of think of the bigger picture and what this could potentially do to the whole state again. And it's certainly not something we want to be going through again.
And Jerome Weimar does say that as soon as they get the information that they need from those removalists, then they will be looking at whether or not any enforcement application or action should be taken.
Western Australia has tightened the rules around compassionate grounds for travellers coming from New South Wales and wanting to enter the state. The state government, WA Police and WA Health are strongly discouraging any West Australian from travelling to New South Wales due to the worsening coronavirus situation. The exemption category also doesn't guarantee a right of entry into WA, even for returning residents. Now, with a closer look at the numbers behind the New South Wales outbreak, here's ABC analyst Casey Briggs.
Let's take the win for today, but with that constant knowledge and vigilance that one single day does not make a trend, and we need to see these sorts of things repeated. Having said that, there is some good news in today's figures, at least 89 cases, so we're no longer seeing the numbers continually increase day on day on day. Again, not making a trend, it is one day. Tuesdays often have some of the lower numbers of testing in the week, and we'll come to testing in a second, but 89 is certainly an improvement on 112. And the makeup of those cases also looks a bit better today in both raw numbers and percentage terms. The number of cases under investigation, as yet unlinked to a known source, that's down. Also, the numbers of cases that were out in the community while infectious is down as well to at most 34, and that includes a handful of cases where the isolation status of those cases is still being determined, but that's 34 down from 64 yesterday. Let's talk actually quickly about the hospitalisation numbers. Only a small increase today, 65 patients with COVID-19 in hospital, but sadly a second death in this outbreak. A man in his 70s from eastern Sydney has now died with COVID-19, so the second person in this outbreak. And given these numbers of hospitalisations are growing, given there are still 4 people on ventilators and about 21 people in intensive care, we should expect that we'll see some more deaths before this outbreak is complete, and we'll expect to see this line continue to grow, sadly, because we know that the people that get seriously ill don't necessarily get seriously ill the second that they're infected, and we've seen a lot of new infections in the last few days. And then just finally, the testing numbers in New South Wales. 49,000 tests reported on a Tuesday, which represents the swabs taken on Sunday in New South Wales. It's actually a pretty good number for a Sunday, and this trend line actually in the last couple of days has turned upward again, and that is a good thing. It's a good sign that we're seeing, but what we're not quite seeing yet is really, really high numbers of testing in certain hotspot areas of Sydney. I want to split Sydney into a few regions, as I think we did yesterday, but this time looking at the number of tests per capita in various parts of Sydney. This yellow line is the eastern Sydney hotspots of Waverley, Woollahra, Sydney, Randwick, and we saw a massive surge in the number of tests per capita in those regions from the moment that this outbreak was discovered in mid-June. That surged and has now since kind of sort of subsided back to, the sorts of levels we're seeing in the rest of Sydney. This pink line is the numbers of tests per capita in the Fairfield, Canterbury Bankstown and Liverpool local government areas, and so far we haven't seen the kinds of surges given how many cases have been found there, given that the test positivity rate has been going up in that part of the city. You'd like to see the numbers of tests going up as well to counter that. We're not yet seeing that. I hope it's coming in the next few days. I hope the testing will ramp up so that we can be sure that there isn't undetected community spread happening, particularly in the local government area of Fairfield, because I think that is still a real risk. There is still definitely the chance that there is significant undetected spread there. And if this curve has any chance of coming down quickly, we need to see that undetected spread stamped out, found and stamped out.
Because when we were talking about this yesterday, you did mention that the way in which this the outbreak had sort of moved from the eastern suburbs across to the west, it could be just that it was actually spreading, or that those cases in the west and southwest of Sydney just weren't being picked up because the testing wasn't there.
Yeah, 2 factors, perhaps not being picked up to a greater level as in the eastern suburbs. And also, I think on average, a case in Western Sydney, a case in the city of Fairfield to be precise, is likely on average to produce more cases, to infect more people than a case in Waverley, in Bondi, say. And that is partly just a function of the fact that households, I've been hammering this point home for a few days now, households tend to be bigger in the city of Fairfield. So for that reason, every case we would expect on average to see more cases than we had seen in Bondi.
So the message for the community is to go and get tested. It's also to go and get vaccinated as soon as possible. What can you tell us about how the vaccine rollout's going so far?
Yeah, so look, it's continuing to inch up, Matt. We've seen just in the last little while, the numbers for today have come through. I think it's 150,000 vaccines doses were administered yesterday, and that's a very good day for a Monday, all things considered. The kind of national trend has been really quite flat, though, and it's kind of inching up slowly, very slowly, and so we're seeing that rate slowly tick up. What I want to show you is this chart here, which breaks down the vaccination rates for different age groups. And what we're starting to see is that among people in the kind of 75 to 79 age group, 75% have a first dose. People between 80 and 84, 74% have a first dose. 73% among people in the 85 to 89 age group. That has been, relatively flat. It's not growing particularly quickly at the moment. The rates among people aged kind of 50 to 70, that's growing a bit faster at the moment. Partly you'd expect that because they have lower vaccination rates at the moment. But we know the vaccination rates among these younger people, well, that's constrained partly by supply because Pfizer is the preferred vaccine for those younger people. For these older people, the preferred vaccine is AstraZeneca, and we have plenty of that in storage at the moment, more than 3 million doses as of the last update from the federal government. That's more than enough to get all of these bars up to 100%, and we're not yet seeing it. So supply is absolutely a problem here. There's another issue here that's preventing people from getting vaccinated.
Well, in scenes that are all too familiar to Australians, large areas of the United States and Canada are enduring record high temperatures, and those conditions are causing dangerous wildfires. Early in the fire season, there are already warnings this year could see the most destructive fires in living memory. Joining me now is Professor Mark Howden, who's the Director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the Australian National University. Professor Howden, thank you for your time today. Can you explain to us first up why these fires are particularly bad and just so catastrophic?
Thanks. Good afternoon. They're particularly bad because of the extraordinary temperatures that have been experienced right now and also over the last several weeks, which have dried out the fuel that feeds the fires, dried out the soil, which cools the environment. And so you've got extraordinarily dry fuel, dry soil, dry air, which just is great conditions for extreme fire conditions. We've seen that ourselves here, for example, in the Black Summer, where we had the same sort of conditions and incredibly dangerous.
We've seen record temperatures being recorded in places like the Death Valley, up in British Columbia, areas you wouldn't normally think of hitting those high 40s in the Celsius marks. But is there anything at this stage that can be done to prevent these sort of fires, or is the damage the change to the climate done and we have to just figure out how to live with it?
Well, the links with these heat conditions and consequently the fires are strengthening as we go. And clearly then, because of that link, one of the critical things we have to do is reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which is putting the foot on the accelerator of climate change. So that's one of the critical things that we need to do. But given that we're not doing that fast enough to prevent ongoing climate change, we need to start to respond to these fires rather than as being exceptional, but starting to treat them as much more a normal part of the risk management that's needed to be done in these environments. And it's not just in the fires that this has to be included, but also in terms of managing urban heat, increased hospitalisations that arise from heat and similar things. So we have to think about the whole of the system and how to adapt that to the future temperature increases we're likely to see.
Should this situation on the west coast of the United States scare people in Australia that this could be about to happen again here?
The particular conditions in that region are different from those which occur in the southern hemisphere because of the different proportions of water we've got. So we've got a lot more ocean in the southern hemisphere, which stops the same sorts of things happening. But in that region, what we're seeing is a strong weakening of the jet stream, and that means that what we talk about the circumpolar vortex, the vortex which rips around the northern hemisphere. Normally, that's actually fairly stable, but because of climate change, what we're seeing is it's become more unstable. So it's like as it slows down, just like if you're riding a bike, you tend to wobble, and so we're seeing these big wobbles in the vortex. And at the moment, what's happening is that's bringing very hot southerly air up over that Canadian environment. And it's also doing that in the North Atlantic and in Siberia and eastern Russia. So there's multiple places which are representing the same sorts of patterns. And because it's a very slow-moving vortex, it means that these systems stay sat for many days on end, and that builds up the heat and builds up the heat. And that's why we get the extraordinary conditions. Now, we see some similar things in the Southern Hemisphere. So, for example, in the Black Summer, we did see those heat domes, the same sort of conditions developing across Australia and bringing desert-like dry air, hot air across southeastern Australia. And in that sense, the heat dome we experience in Australia is similar to what's been experienced in Canada, but for somewhat different climatological reasons.
So different circumstances, but leading to similar sort of situations. Are there any countries around the world that are actually doing quite well in addressing this sort of situation, or at least in the planning for how they deal with these threats?
Well, if I had to choose three countries who are doing aspects of this extraordinarily well, it would be Australia, the US and Canada. Long histories of very effective fire management, great technical and human expertise and capabilities. But in the face of these sorts of fires and these sorts of conditions, even the best systems don't necessarily remove that risk of large-scale fires. And really importantly, we're likely to see these sorts of fires increase in frequency. So the catastrophic fires becoming much more frequent as climate change increases. So our ability to manage that risk is going to be less, and the likelihood of really serious consequences of that is likely to grow.
And so we had a Royal Commission into the Black Summer here in Australia, which made a whole raft of recommendations. How do you think the nation's ticking along and actually implementing some of those findings?
Look, I haven't kept my finger on the pulse of all of those recommendations, but there are organisations who do that and who are critical of the pace of the rollout and the completion of those recommendations. And so I'm not in a position where I can particularly critique that, but there are others who can actually do that, and you can look on the web for that sort of information. I think critically with the multiple Royal Commissions we've had about our fires, what they do is they outline a whole series of recommendations which have actually been repeated many, many times over the years. So one of the first things we have to do is look at the whole history of recommendations, identify those ones which are consistent across many, many different Royal Commissions or similar reports, and then start to implement those in a really significant way. If we don't, we're just going to increase the risks associated with future fires.
Professor Mark Howden from the Australian National University, thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Matt.
Now with a roundup of the day's sports news, here's Catherine Murphy.
In AFL, North Melbourne has notched up one of the upsets of the season with a 10-point win over the West Coast Eagles in Perth. The young Kangaroos, who sit bottom of the ladder, subjected the Eagles to their third consecutive loss of the season. Jaden Stevenson was outstanding for North with 38 touches and one major. Here's what the coach, David Noble, had to say after.
Yeah, really important. The growth, I think, the experience that our guys have gained tonight, travelling away, playing a mature team, a team in the finals, generally a hostile environment, to be able to be headed, show some resilience and show some grit. I think it's a massive tick to the players for what we're trying to build together, and our members are involved in that. So, yeah, it's a significant night for our club.
England captain Harry Kane has told those behind the racist abuse of teammates Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho and Bukayo Saka, "You're not an England fan and we don't want you." Kane posted on Twitter after the three players who missed penalties were targeted on social media after the game. Kane said the players deserve support and backing, not the vile racist abuse they received. In rugby, the Wallabies have the chance to seal a series win when they take on France in the second of their three-match test series in Melbourne tonight. The Wallabies won the first test 23-21 in a nail-biter. They've made one change to the starting lineup, with prop Taniela Tupou starting and Alan Alaalatoa moving to the bench.
Now with a check of the weather, here's Nate Byrne.
A major front that ploughed through WA over the last 24 hours is continuing to move eastwards. Behind it, some very windy conditions mean that the Bureau is still warning for damaging winds gusting to 100 kilometres an hour, as well as damaging surf and abnormally high tides through the southwest of WA. It is weakening as it moves through South Australia today, bringing some widespread falls, but not huge totals, and it will have enough to carry through into the east. Mostly it'll dump its rainfall over the ranges before it gets to the coast, but then it opens the door for subsequent fronts to come in. That'll bring a very wet and windy one to some parts of South Australia as we get towards the weekend, and some pretty big totals expected for the southeast ranges over the coming week. And it all starts through the south tomorrow. In fact, if you're in Brisbane, you're fine. It's getting to 23, but anywhere south of that, Sydney's looking at a possible shower, 19 the top. It's going to be wet in Canberra, getting to 11, and Melbourne, where it's getting to 14. A couple of falls for Hobart as well, 12 degrees the top there. Adelaide, you can expect more showers. 17 will be the top for you. Perth, some wet weather, maybe with a late storm, 18 the maximum. And up north, Darwin's missing out on all of it. Staying sunny, getting to 33.
You're watching ABC News. The top stories this hour. As New South Wales records 89 cases of COVID and a second death, the Premier says there'll be an update on Sydney's lockdown situation by Thursday at the latest. The outbreak spreads to regional New South Wales with a case detected in Goulburn. Federal government to announce financial assistance for New South Wales businesses and residents struggling with the lockdown. And the woman appointed to investigate defence and veteran suicides dumped after less than a year. Now I'm just going to bring you an update. We are waiting on the Prime Minister to step up for a press conference in Sydney. He's at his official residence in Kirribilli, subject to the same Sydney lockdown restrictions as everyone else, just maybe in a bit more lush surrounds there. So we will bring you that press conference as soon as it happens. I also want to bring you some news that's just come to us here in the newsroom regarding the advice from the Expert Advisory Committee looking at the use of coronavirus vaccines, ATAGI, or the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation. Now, they've been looking at the situation surrounding the AstraZeneca vaccine. We know that this is an area that ATAGI has made a number of rulings on in the past. First of all, saying that Australians over the age of 50 should get the AstraZeneca shot, not those under who should get Pfizer, then bumping that up to the age of 60 and that people below that should get or it's recommended they should get the Pfizer vaccine. They've just issued a statement in the last couple of minutes saying that they have reconsidered that situation. The advice for the whole nation is not changing. It is still that AstraZeneca is the recommended vaccine for those over the age of 60, Pfizer the recommended shot for those under the age of 60. But ATAGI has put in place a bit of a caveat when there are lockdown situations and outbreaks such as what we're seeing in Sydney at the moment. ATAGI is saying that in the context of a COVID-19 outbreak where the supply of the Pfizer vaccine is constrained, adults younger than 60 years old who do not have immediate access to Pfizer should be able to reassess the benefits to them and their contacts from being vaccinated with AstraZeneca versus the rare risk of a serious side effect. So in other words, if you can't get access to a Pfizer vaccine and you are in an outbreak area at the moment, ATAGI is saying that you should be looking at the AstraZeneca vaccine as a solution there. It's also made an updating of its advice with regards to the time between the first and second doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine. At the moment, it's between 4 and 12 weeks, depending on what the circumstances are. And most parts of the country are observing that 12-week outer limit for the second dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine. However, in New South Wales, authorities now saying get it closer to that 8-week period. Atagi is now saying that the situation for people in an outbreak situation should be that they can get their second dose of the vaccine 4 weeks after getting their first. So those people in an outbreak situation who've received their first dose of AstraZeneca more than 4 weeks ago should contact their vaccine provider to arrange a second dose as soon as possible. So no doubt the Prime Minister will be getting some questions on that advice, which has just come through to us. And as I mentioned, we'll bring you that press conference as soon as it begins. Well, the British government has confirmed almost all of the coronavirus restrictions that have been in place in England throughout the pandemic will end next Monday. The easing will come with a warning that the UK can expect COVID deaths and hospital admissions to rise before the current wave peaks sometime next month.
For those in England wondering how things will be different from next Monday, there was a change of tone from the government today. Masks and face coverings will be expected in certain places like crowded public transport, even as legal restrictions are lifted on July the 19th, with the key message being caution.
This pandemic is not over. This disease, coronavirus, continues to carry risks for you and your family. We cannot simply revert instantly from Monday the 19th of July to life as it was before COVID.
There's no doubt that we are in a third wave of infection. Infections are rising rapidly, and I expect them to continue to rise. And the more mixing we have, the more infection is going to spread. So there's no doubt that step 4 will bring increases in spread of infection. And although the relationship between infections and hospitalisation is different, it still exists.
Scientists and modellers predict that the current wave of infections will reach a peak in August. There could be between 1,000 and 2,000 daily hospital admissions and between 100 and 200 deaths each day. But all that depends on a certain amount of continued caution by the public. For example, mask wearing in some crowded indoor spaces. Those hospital numbers could be around half the peak seen in January, and COVID patients now tend to be younger and need less time in hospital. But leading doctors are concerned about the mounting pressure.
Not only are we managing the backlog from last year, we're also trying to do normal activity, but we're also seeing a rise in admissions with patients with COVID. So as healthcare professionals, we are really worried about what's going to happen over the coming weeks.
Labour had this response to the changes.
Well, look, we all want to ease restrictions, but with infection rates still going up at the rate they're going up, this plan is still reckless, I'm afraid. We need a safe way of coming through this.
There's now a push to get as many young adults as possible to come forward for their first doses. Southampton City Council ran a walk-in service over the weekend, billed Grab a Jab. National and local officials feel they have to push the message more strongly. That's because take-up of first doses has fallen, and it's not down to supply issues. It was fairly consistent during June, but since the end of the month, measured by the 7-day rolling average, it's more than halved. Government scientists have urged people to get vaccinated to reduce the chance of getting ill. They say there's no ideal date for easing restrictions, and delaying wouldn't mean a different outcome.
Let's stay with COVID news, and prominent health experts and scientists are urging authorities to fast-track the approval of vaccine mixing and the mandatory use of masks indoors and outdoors to fight the current COVID outbreak in Sydney. 5 doctors have written to the New South Wales and federal health ministers with recommendations to help deal with the Delta strain. Paediatrician Dr Kate Jardine is one of them. She says several countries allow vaccines to be mixed, and Australia should too.
There is significant evidence coming out at the moment from Spain, Germany, and in particular in Canada. This is being utilised, where the AstraZeneca vaccine is being followed by a Pfizer vaccine. And there's some good information on this in Nature that was published 2 months ago. In particular, in the situation that we have in Australia here, we've actually got a glut of AstraZeneca for people aged 60 and above, and we're awaiting Pfizer doses. And so it would be a really sensible idea for this to be considered on the table in Australia for us to follow Canada's lead in that regard. There's nothing that says if you've had one dose of AstraZeneca that in the future you wouldn't be able to have a Pfizer dose if that became more readily available. So absolutely, people are not just choosing now for the rest of their lives which dosing trail they'll go down. By and large, GPs are ready and willing to help. They're keeping their eye on advice from ATAGI. They're trying to keep up with the latest evidence. And by and large, I think they will generally follow what ATAGI sets out. It is possible that a GP may refuse, but they will then have the obligation to tell the patient that they can get that.
I'm going to leave Kate Jardine there and take you live to Kirribilli. The press conference with the Prime Minister and New South Wales Premier is just starting.
This has been a period of great cooperation between the Commonwealth and the state government. The pandemic continues to evolve. It continues to set its own rules. And what's incredibly important that as governments around the country, whether it's the New South Wales government and the Commonwealth government, state and territory governments around the country, we must continue to work together to keep pace and, where possible, get ahead of those events wherever we possibly can. And Australia's record when it comes to saving lives and saving livelihoods speaks to the way that we've been able to do that together. And no more has that been the case than here in New South Wales, that has done an exemplary job in saving lives and livelihoods during the course of this pandemic. As we have gone through this year, as we remain in the suppression phase, we came to an agreement at National Cabinet a few weeks back, before these most recent lockdowns, where we agreed that the Commonwealth would provide support directly for income support for individuals, and that state governments and territory governments would provide the support for business payments. Now, in the case of the lockdown that most recently occurred in Victoria, that's exactly what has occurred, and we have followed those same arrangements here in New South Wales that were put in place for Victoria. Thankfully, that lockdown only endured for 2 weeks. But clearly here in New South Wales, the situation has taken a very different turn. The New South Wales outbreak has proved to be more severe, more dangerous, and it's in the national interest that we now put in place an upgraded set of arrangements for cooperation with the states and territories that will first be put in place here with New South Wales when lockdowns enter into more protracted situations, i.e. we're now about to go, we're in week 3 now, and the Premier obviously will make further announcements at the appropriate time about where the lockdown goes from here. Throughout our response as a Commonwealth Government, and equally at the state level, we have always followed key principles for providing that support. It needs to be targeted, it needs to be timely, it needs to be proportionate, scalable, and the administration of those supports need to be done in a way so it can get to people as simply and as quickly as is possible. That is what was so essential when in March of last year and April of last year we put in place the arrangements about the cash flow boost, the support payments to keep apprentices in jobs, and what ultimately then was done with programs like JobKeeper. Their design was built around those core principles. And so it has been the case as we've worked together over the course of these last few days to ensure that we can put in place an upgraded response for both individual and business support in the course of this lockdown as it goes into a protracted phase. Currently, right now, you are able to receive a payment if you've lost more than 20 hours of work a week in the Sydney metropolitan area, the Greater Sydney area, of $325. So if you've lost between 8 and 20 hours, doesn't matter if you're a casual, a part-time worker, a full-time worker, there is no application of what's called the liquid assets means test. You can call 180-2266 or go to the Services Australia website and you can apply for access to that payment. It works exactly like the disaster payments that we provide in the wake of whether it's a flood or a cyclone or any of those other events, bushfires and so on, that has been provided by the Commonwealth for disaster payments. You can get that payment right now. You don't have to have lost your job. You don't have to have left your employer. It doesn't matter who your employer is. If you have lost those hours, you can access that payment right now. What we have decided to do to go forward into week 4 is that those payments will be increased to $600 for those who have lost more than 20 hours and increased to $375 for those who have lost between 8 and 20 hours a week, or 1 day a week in hours, or up to 20 hours a week. Those payments, by applying for those first 4 local government areas that went into the lockdown first, that's this Friday, you apply again to access those payments, and then they become a recurring payment for the extent of the lockdown. So you won't need to keep reapplying all the time. Of course, if your circumstances changed and you get hours back, then we would require you to advise us of that, and we would adjust the payments accordingly. But this ensures that as we go into the next week, that people can get that higher levels of support. They can get it through that simple process of calling 180-2266 or on the Services Australia website, and that payment is then recurring from that point on. Now, as a result of the partnership with the New South Wales Government, that payment will not only be made in the Greater Sydney area as defined by the Commonwealth hotspot, but because of the New South Wales Government support, they will be supplementing that to ensure that that payment can be made available statewide. So areas outside the Commonwealth hotspot area, and those 2 payments will be available right across the state of New South Wales, with New South Wales picking up the costs of that broader payment in the regional and rural areas, and the Commonwealth continuing to meet the costs in the metropolitan areas. I note that those payments of $600 and $375 were the payments that were in place during the December quarter, which was when the Victorian lockdown was still in place last year. Of the lockdowns we're looking at, this lockdown and the circumstances we're dealing with are more akin to what we saw at the beginning of that process than what we saw most recently. And I note that during that lockdown, the Commonwealth provided to the state of Victoria, in the form of JobKeeper, specifically $13.4 billion. That was the support provided to the Victorian public in relation to the long lockdown that we had, regrettably, in Victoria. I also note that in the Northern Beaches lockdown earlier this year, the Commonwealth provided over $1 billion in that support into those communities to provide support going through that very difficult time. So the payments are what they were back in the last quarter of last year at $600 and $375. The other thing we have agreed to do, and cost share 50-50, which the Premier and the Treasurer will go into more detail on, is to provide a direct payment to businesses up to a turnover of $50 million a year. That payment will be made. It's modelled on the program we did with the cash flow boost last year, which you'll remember we made payments of between $10,000 and $50,000 over a 3-month period. Okay, it wasn't over a week or 2 weeks. It was made over a 3-month period, and we did that for 2 successive quarters. So through the cash flow boost, we provided as a Commonwealth Government between $20,000 and $100,000 to support the cash flow of businesses over a 6-month period. Now, it is certainly our intention and our hope, and I know the Premier and the Treasurers, that we will not be in that situation, and everything is being done to prevent that. And I thank those right across Sydney and more broadly across New South Wales for their patience in going through the current lockdown. But the payments that we'll be making to businesses of up to $50 million are $1,000 for sole traders, and then payments of between $1,500 and $10,000 per week, paid on a fortnightly basis to businesses of that order. And those payments have a maximum, as I said, of $10,000, and payments can be made up to 40% of turnover. So for the businesses that are much smaller, they will receive a minimum of $1,500, and then it goes at 40% of your payroll, I should say, not turnover, of your payroll amount, and then it maxes out at $10,000. That will come at a cost between the Commonwealth and the states of around $500 million a week, met equally by the state and the Commonwealth Government. And the New South Wales Treasurer and Premier will say more about that. The third area that I wanted to mention today is it's not just about getting through this economically, it's about bringing people through in a healthy state of mind. As we found in the Victorian lockdown, the provision of additional mental health support was absolutely critical. We'll be doing that again here with the state government. Commonwealth is committing $12.25 million as part of around about a $7.5 million package thereabouts, which will be providing additional supports of $1.5 million to Lifeline. This is from the Commonwealth. Support for Kids Helpline, Headspace, Beyond Blue, a range of key organisations that have been so critical to supporting the mental health of at that time Victorians and now those from Sydney and New South Wales who can access that additional support through these services. The Butterfly Foundation also receiving support, youth support, as I said, through Headspace. I particularly want to send a message to those students who are doing their HSC, which I'm sure the Treasurer and the Premier will join me in sending. We know this is a tough time for you. HSC students in 2020 were going through a very similar process, particularly down there in Victoria. And you will get through this. This support is being put there particularly to help you. And so I'd encourage parents and community members to let young people know that help is at hand and you can access that help, and we are upping the services to ensure that that help will be there for you as you go through what I know is a very difficult time. So you're very much in our thoughts. So to summarise again, additional support for individuals, additional support for businesses through a new shared program between the Commonwealth and the state government, and additional support to help people with their mental health as they go through this pandemic lockdown. I'll hand you over to the Premier.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And can I begin by thanking you and our respective Treasurers, Josh Frydenberg and Dom Perrottet, for working so closely together to be able to deliver this package for the people of New South Wales. And whilst the Prime Minister has quite rightly outlined what is the national framework for these payments, the New South Wales Government was very pleased to be able to extend with our part of the payments to all of New South Wales, so that no matter where you live, if you're suffering because of the stay-at-home provisions, you are able to make sure that you and your loved ones don't go through that stress no matter how the lockdown lasts. Now, can I make this point? Our intention always is to have this lockdown not go longer than it needs to. But these payments will make sure that whether you're someone who runs a business or someone who's an employee, you'll be able to respect the rules we've put in place and also have peace of mind. It's really having peace of mind and also the ability to follow the health advice, because they're the two things that will help us get through this lockdown. And that's why I'm very pleased with the package that's announced today. Essentially, individuals will go through Services Australia for their payments, and businesses will go through Services New South Wales. And in terms of where you get your information, they're the two bodies that you go to, and we'll make sure that we give you the information you need during what is, we understand, a very stressful time for people. I'm also pleased to say that the New South Wales Treasurer will also announce other measures that we'll be taking as a state government, which are over and above what the Prime Minister has announced, and they're specific to our state, including payroll tax exemptions and other opportunities for businesses to get support from us. But in the first instance, I do want to thank the Prime Minister, the Federal Treasurer, and also my Treasurer here in New South Wales for the work they've done to support New South Wales during this difficult time. We never can predict the twists and turns of a pandemic, but what we do know is that in order to have this lockdown end in a timely way but also provide support to our citizens, it's important to make these arrangements clear as soon as possible, and I'm grateful for the speed with which the Commonwealth has responded to the issues that we raised. I now ask Treasurer Perrottet to outline some New South Wales specific details, and then we'll take questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Premier. We know it's a very challenging and difficult time for businesses and workers right across the state. This is not just a health crisis, it's an economic one too. And our message today to every business and every worker right across New South Wales is that we've got through the last 18 months, and together we will get through this period of time as well. The package that we've developed, we believe, provides support for every worker, for every business right across the state. I want to join the Premier in thanking the Prime Minister and the Federal Treasurer for the constructive and cooperative way that we've worked through the details of this cash booster scheme, which will provide important cash flow to businesses to ensure we keep as many workers in work and as many businesses going during this period of time. An important part of this package is to ensure that those businesses who access this payment will also be required not to reduce their headcount. We want to keep as many workers in work during this period of time. The New South Wales economy is stronger today than it was before the pandemic. We've always said we'll prioritise the economy before the budget. We have done that, and that's ensured the economy is stronger, that more people are in work than when the pandemic began, and that's where we'll be once we get through this difficult time as well. As the Premier has indicated, we'll also be providing support as part of that disaster payment for workers right across the state who will be able to access that, not just in the hotspots that have been declared. So as the Premier has outlined, those payments can be made through Services Australia, and we encourage all workers right across New South Wales, because we know this is not just focused on Sydney. There are many workers who are doing it tough outside those areas, and they'll now be able to access that program as well. In addition to this program today, we're also announcing a further expansion and extension to our small business grants. They will increase, and access to those will be expanded for businesses with payrolls of up to $10 million. We will also be deferring all payroll tax liabilities for the next 2 months, and for those businesses with a reduction in turnover of 30%, which are under $10 million in payrolls, we will completely waive payroll tax for the first quarter this year. We're also providing support for micro businesses as part of the package today. Those businesses with a turnover of less than $75,000 but greater than $30,000 have received a turnover reduction of 30% during this period of time will receive a payment of $1,500 per fortnight, starting from week 1 of the lockdown period until the completion. In addition to that, we will also be providing support for tenants, commercial tenants and retail tenants. We will be mandating that there'll be no lockouts or evictions during this period of time, and any rent reduction from landlords to their tenants in that space, we will provide a rebate or discount in relation to land tax payable from that landlord to the state. So we want to encourage retailers right across New South Wales to work with landlords to make sure we all get through this difficult time together. In addition to that, we'll also be providing protections when it comes to residential tenancies. There will be no evictions for the next 60 days for those who are doing it tough, for workers who have had a reduction in income by 25%. I will also provide the same land tax reductions and rebates for residential landlords who can provide some rental relief for their tenants. For those landlords that don't qualify for land tax, we'll provide a $1,500 payment as well to also reduce the rental obligations for those tenants. We're also providing today, in addition to the mental health support with the Commonwealth Government, some extra support to ensure that those people right across New South Wales who are sleeping rough, close to another additional 4,000 temporary accommodation places in the state. It's a program that has worked from the start of the pandemic. We want to make sure that whoever you are right across the state, all vulnerable people are given the protections and support they can. We have always said from the start that we will prioritise the economy before the budget. So whether you're a casual worker, a permanent worker, a small business, a large business, the New South Wales Government has your back. We are going to get through this difficult time and come out stronger on the other side. I want to finish by thanking the Prime Minister and the Federal Treasurer once again for working very closely.
This is where we farewell our viewers on ABC TV and all states and territories other than New South Wales. To keep watching, switch now to the ABC News channel.
Get through this difficult time. Thank you. Well, in conjunction with the Commonwealth, we're putting another $4.1 billion. So our package today is $4.1 billion, with the Commonwealth over $5 billion. The $1.4 billion for that small business program has been expanded. That will now be $2.1 billion and will provide an opportunity for small businesses to have access to, was previously up to $10,000 in grants. That will now be up to $15,000 to provide that important support.
How long would that last for? How many weeks?
Well, some of those payments are one-off payments, But obviously with the package that we're announcing today in conjunction with the Commonwealth will be paid on a fortnightly basis for as long as the lockdown continues, and obviously for some of the support packages in relation to those micro businesses, that will play out as well from week 1 for the duration of the lockdown.
Just on the individual payments, they will go, that is the $600 payment, $375, that will continue as long as the lockdown continues. And of course, the point that the Treasurer has just made is that we estimate the cost of this each week is around $500 million. It's demand driven, so that's not an allocation, that's just a very initial estimate of what the expenditure may be in these circumstances. And the Commonwealth understands that we'll be continuing to support that for as long as the lockdown remains in place, and hopefully that won't be too long. And I have no doubt that New South Wales will ensure it will only go as long as it have to, but it'll go for as long as it needs to.
Prime Minister, if I can ask, the New South Wales Treasurer mentioned that cash flow payments will require staffing levels not to adjust. I think it's from 13 July. How will you enforce that, and what are the penalties?
Well, it's based on a head count as of the date of the announcement, which is today, and the undertaking for people receiving this payment is that that's what they will indeed do. Now, we've had similar type arrangements in place in the past. We expect people to honour their commitments, and you know what? People have. There's right now, particularly in New South Wales, but I'd say more broadly, it was only a month ago that employers were coming to me saying that we needed to get more people into the country because they needed more workers. People in New South Wales, employers, and particularly in New South Wales, understand that the labour market has got a lot tighter over the course of this last 12 months. 1 million people, thereabouts, have come back into work since the pit of the recession caused by the COVID pandemic. So it's not in any New South Wales employer's interest to leave staff behind at the moment. They know that they will need those staff in a few weeks' time, hopefully. It's as soon as that. And they'll be wanting to keep them on their books. And so that's why I just want to stress with this payment again, you can still remain with your employer. So you may have been working 40 hours a week and you have agreed to reduce your hours down to 20 hours a week. That means you can keep working in that business under those arrangements, and you can pick up the $600 payment from the Commonwealth, and that will help you continue to go through what is a difficult time. Previously, those payments were made through JobKeeper. Because that was a national scheme involving very large scale, that's not necessary on this occasion. We can get those payments directly to people who have lost those hours directly through the Services Australia system. I can't hear you, sorry.
How often do people businesses and individuals have to verify that they've either lost hours or they've lost
Well, I'll let the Treasurer speak to the second matter, but for individuals, they will have to go on, if they're in those first 4, I think it was, Gladys, LGAs, they're eligible to go on this Friday and to make their claim for these new payments, and then they are recurring. You don't need to go back in after that for the extent of the lockdown. For businesses, it's also a one-step process, but the Treasurer can give you the timelines on the registration and application and payment timeframes for that.
Yeah, thanks, Prime Minister. So in relation to the small business grants, which you've already announced, applications can be made on the 19th of July. And in relation to the joint arrangement with the Commonwealth for that cash booster program, expression of interest will be open tomorrow. And we want those funds out the door as quickly as possible. But importantly, this provides certainty to businesses that they can keep their staff on. That's why all our programs have ensured that on application you must make sure that you do not reduce your headcount. We are going to get through this. It's a difficult time, but we want to keep as much cash flow going into businesses as during this time. And we believe that the quantum of this program, this unprecedented investment, will ensure that we'll get through the other side stronger than ever. In relation to the question on the individual payments, as the Prime Minister has said, once that application is made through Services Australia, it's then an ongoing payment for the length of the lockdown.
Expressions of interest open tomorrow. When will money go out the door?
Now, as quickly as possible. Obviously, we want to make sure that those funds are verified. We're working very closely with Service New South Wales. We've had success in the past in relation to getting that money as quickly as possible to businesses who need it. In relation to the small business application, as I said, on the 19th, applications open. It's within 6 days, and payments will be processed by Service New South Wales within 4 days. So that's the payment of $15,000 for businesses with a reduction of 70% turnover, a payment of $7,500 for businesses with a reduction of 50% turnover. Those payments will be available for application on 19th of July. And in relation to the program we're announcing today in conjunction with the Commonwealth, we want expressions of interest will be open tomorrow, and we will have applications opened as quickly as possible and as close to the date that we have for those small business grants.
It would seem obvious now read this that lockdown does continue into next week.
Oh, look, I've already made clear the unlikelihood of the lockdown finishing on Friday, and the numbers speak for themselves, and we'll have more to say about that tomorrow. But what this does is give us peace of mind and a breather for everybody, in that when you provide that economic support for individuals and businesses, it gives us the freedom to do what we need on the health side by asking everybody to respect the advice that we're providing, but also having that confidence not to leave the house unless you absolutely have to. And this financial support, which we're very grateful is a joint measure with the Commonwealth and ourselves, gives us that freedom, gives everybody that breather to be able to follow the health advice and to try and get out of this lockdown as quickly as we can. So I wouldn't read too much into the length of the lockdown, because none of us know that. But what we do know is that we have the financial support there so that individuals and families and businesses don't have to stress, and they know that for the duration of the lockdown the support will be there, and the support will be there both from the Commonwealth and from the state government, working together to make sure every individual or business across the state has access to it, which is very important. And also, irrespective of when the payment goes in the bank accounts, and obviously we'd like that to happen as quickly as possible, it gives people peace of mind so that your bank or whomever you deal with has peace of mind the money is coming, it's there, and you can make decisions against that.
Prime Minister, we keep hearing that the Delta strain new variant clearly changes the game, and that we can't live with the Delta variant until the majority of our adult population here in New South Wales is vaccinated. If we can't live with the Delta variant as cases don't come under control and the health advice necessitates a longer lockdown, is the Commonwealth prepared to pay all of this cash until the vast majority of our adult population is vaccinated?
Well, what I indicated at the outset was that what I'm announcing today is not just a partnership with New South Wales. What I'm announcing today is an upgrading of the Commonwealth Government's national response. So it is certainly our hope and ambition that we would not see lockdowns extending like we're seeing them here in New South Wales and other states and territories. But as I said, COVID-19 will set those rules. And so what we're saying is that when situations get like this, it is in the national interest that we ensure that a lockdown that is occurring here in New South Wales will be effective. It will be effective, and that Australians living here in New South Wales and across particularly the Greater Sydney area know that the sacrifices they're making will get the job done, and that we will support them through that. Help is here, and help is on the way as well. That's, I think, our key message.
A lot more than that. Is it enough of an incentive for them to not sack staff?
Sure, it's a very good question. Now, first of all, I'd say you've got to look at it as a combination of both the business support and the support we're providing directly to individuals. So the $600 support, the business now no longer, if they've reduced hours of someone, they don't have to be as concerned as they were before under JobKeeper to make those payments. The Commonwealth Government is making those payments. So if you're an employer, and sadly you may have had casual employees, or you're speaking to your permanent employees and say, we really need you to do less hours at the moment because we can't afford to pay that, they can say ring 1800-2266 and the Commonwealth will be able to give you that income support to get through that period of time for a couple of weeks. So that would have otherwise gone through the business. Now it's going direct to the person who needs that money. That means it's available right now. Help is there right now. And so if you get on that line, which is Friday for those first 4 LGAs, for the rest of the state and the broader Greater Metropolitan Sydney area, it's Monday, then you can access that. For the businesses, we have modelled this on the cash flow boost that we provided last year. And so to give you an example, the weekly payment that was made under the cash flow boost last year for businesses with a turnover of, say, $75,000 a year was $769. Under this program, it's $1,500. If you look at a business with a turnover of around $1 million last time, then the payments that were made available back then were around $1,900, and they're $1,900 now. When you go to a business which has a turnover of some $5 million, then previously they were receiving a $3,846 cash boost per week. Under this program, they're getting $7,692. See, what we've learnt during the pandemic is you do what works. And when you need to do it again, you do what works. And the support that has been provided through this cash flow boost is not only commensurate with what was provided last time, but in most cases it's actually greater because it needs to be more concentrated. It's kicking in week 4 and it will go for as long as the lockdown requires.
Just on the lockdown, if I could ask the New South Wales Treasurer, you
disagreed with the Premier? You thought that there shouldn't be an extension of the lockdown. Is that still your view, or have you been mugged by reality?
Not at all. I mean, we're going to talk about discussions we have in crisis cabinet, but ultimately we've always balanced here in our state the economic needs with the health needs, and this is not just a health crisis. And you know, every single business and worker out there right across our state who's struggling right now, we say today that we have your back. And the Prime Minister's spoken about the challenges of different variants. The reality is, and the difficult reality is that as you see around the world, that as these variants change, there are always challenges as the vaccination period rolls out. And ultimately, we will have to learn to live alongside the virus. And we don't want to be in a position, we've always resisted going into lockdowns in this state. There has to be a balanced and proportionate response. We have always done that. We want to keep the people of New South Wales safe. We have done that. We've done that right across the country in a way that is world leading. And ultimately, we're in a position economically where New South Wales is stronger today than it was at the outset of the pandemic. So yes, there are challenges facing our state and our country, but also we have come through the last 18 months and will come out stronger during this period of time as well.
Basically on pause. The lockdown has really threatened that. What does that mean for the plan? I mean, do you think that this can still go ahead in any realistic form?
Well, you know, we're committed to looking at the pilot, and obviously right now the complete focus of the New South Wales government is making sure we keep our people safe, we keep as many businesses in business and as many workers in jobs during this period of time. That is the Premier's focus, that is my focus, that is our entire crisis cabinet focus. But also, that is a very important industry to the New South Wales economy. And we need to ensure that we get international students back into our state as quickly as possible. There are tens of thousands of men and women right across our state who rely on that industry for work. We're completely committed to doing it. And obviously we'll deal with this challenge that's in front of us now, this immediate challenge, and then we'll get back to work on ensuring that we bring back that industry to New South Wales. And importantly, I'll make this comment as well, when it comes to bringing back returning Australians. Let's not forget that New South Wales has taken the lion's share of returning Australians. More than half of those Australians returning back to this country have come through Sydney. We have done the heavy lifting in relation to that. I will always act in the national interest in that space, but ultimately that is an industry. It's our largest service export here in New South Wales, our second largest overall export, and it's important for many men and women right across our state who rely on that industry to provide for their families.
80% of the rate of flights out that you're waiting on flights still. When it comes to you setting these thresholds, that's something that should be based purely on their advice and health advice, or the other factors that have to be weighed in.
Well, there's always other factors, and what I said at the press conference we had here last week was that, of course, the decisions we're making will be informed, absolutely, the Premier and I and the other members of the National Cabinet, because as the Treasurer just rightly said, there are a range of interests here, and there are the economic interests, there are the health and wellbeing interests, and of course there's the epidemiology, which we've asked them to provide advice on. What the Doherty Institute can give to leaders is what the spectrum of risk is. Now, in the UK at the moment, they haven't quite reached 65% on 2 doses. The UK government has made a series of decisions. They're also seeing, we know, very high levels of cases, and they've seen some escalation in the levels of hospitalisation. There are a lot of experiences that we're watching very closely around the world, and there is no simple, definitive pop-out answer here. It's based on an assessment and evaluation of risk. And what we've asked the Doherty Institute to indicate to us is what that balance of risk is and how you can then adjust measures to suit that risk to ensure that we meet all the objectives that we need to have as a country. What is important is that we continue to move as quickly as we possibly can. Certainly by this time next week, and indeed earlier, we will have passed the mark of over 10 million doses, and the vaccination program continues to gather pace. And that is welcome. The additional Pfizer doses that come available, the additional that were provided to New South Wales this week, the opening of new clinics and the opening of new clinics. The Chester Hill Clinic, I understand, is opening very, very soon, importantly in southwestern Sydney. All of this is happening, and so it's important that people go and support that. And we move. I believe that by the end of this year, we will have gotten that position where we have offered everybody who seeks a vaccine, and we are aiming to have that percentage as high as it possibly can be. But on that note, can I thank the Premier, can I thank the Treasurer, and can I thank the Treasurer Frydenberg as well, and all of our Treasury officials who've been burning the midnight oil over the course of these last few days, particularly last night, for the great work that they've been doing to bring together what I think is a very important package. We have always got through COVID together. Governments have got through it together. Communities have got through it together. Families have got through it together. And that will continue to be the case. This is a next level of partnership that is necessary to ensure the sacrifices that are being made across Greater Sydney and across New South Wales are going to get the results that we're looking for. And that is that we can move back into the position we were at some weeks ago, and that we can get those people back to work, those jobs saved, Treasurer, and ensuring that we're in a position for New South Wales economy to pick up where it left off, which has been, the powerhouse of the national economy, frankly, during the course of the COVID pandemic. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Hello and welcome to an extended edition of Afternoon Briefing here on ABC News. I'm Patricia Carver.